Exodus 2. This chapter begins the story of Moses, that man of renown, famed for his intimate acquaintance with heaven and his eminent usefulness on earth, and the most remarkable type of Christ, as a prophet, savior, lawgiver, and mediator, in all the Old Testament. The Jews have a book among them of the life of Moses, which tells a great many stories concerning him, which we have reason to think are mere fictions. What he has recorded concerning himself is what we may rely upon, for we know that his record is true. And it is what we may be satisfied with, for it is what infinite wisdom thought fit to preserve and transmit to us. In this chapter we have, I. the perils of his birth and infancy, v. 2. His preservation through those perils, and the preferment of his childhood and youth, v. 3. The pious choice of his riper years, which was to own the people of God. 1. He offered them his service at present, if they would accept it, v. 2. He retired, that he might reserve himself for further service hereafter, v. IV. The dawning of the day of Israel's deliverance, v. 23, etc. Verses 14. Moses was a Levite, both by father and mother. Jacob left Levi under marks of disgrace, General 49, 5. And yet, soon after, Moses appears a descendant from him, that he might typify Christ, who came in the likeness of sinful flesh and was made a curse for us. This tribe began to be distinguished from the rest by the birth of Moses, as afterwards it became remarkable in many other instances. Observe, concerning this newborn infant, how he was hidden. It seems to have been just at the time of his birth that the cruel law was made for the murder of all the male children of the Hebrews, and many, no doubt, perished by the execution of it. The parents of Moses had Miriam and Aaron, both older than he, born to them before this edict came out, and had nursed them without that peril. But those that begin the world in peace know not what troubles they may meet with before they have got through it. Probably the mother of Moses was full of anxiety in the expectation of his birth, now that this edict was in force, and was ready to say, "Blessed are the barren that never bore, Lu. Better so than bring forth children to the murderer, Hos." Yet this child proves the glory of his father's house. Thus that which is most our fear often proves, in the issue, most our joy. Observe the beauty of providence. Just at the time when Pharaoh's cruelty rose to this height, the deliverer was born, though he did not appear for many years after. Note, when men are projecting the church's ruin, God is preparing for its salvation. Moses, who was afterwards to bring Israel out of this house of bondage, was himself in danger of falling a sacrifice to the fury of the oppressor, God so ordering it that, being afterwards told of this, he might be the more animated with a holy zeal for the deliverance of his brethren out of the hands of such bloody men. 1. His parents observed him to be a goodly child, more than ordinarily beautiful. He was fair to God, Acts 7:20. They fancied he had a luster in his countenance that was something more than human, and was a specimen of the shining of his face afterwards, example 34:29. Note, God sometimes gives early earnests of his gifts, and manifests himself betimes in those for whom and by whom he designs to do great things. Thus he put an early strength into Samson, Judge 13:24-25, and early forwardness into Samuel 1 Sa. 2:18, wrought an early deliverance for David 1 Sa. 17:37, and began betimes with Timothy 1 Tim. 2. Therefore they were the more solicitous for his preservation, because they looked upon this as an indication of some kind purpose of God concerning him, and a happy omen of something great. Note, a lively active faith can take encouragement from the least intimation of the divine favor. A merciful hint of providence will encourage those whose spirits make diligent search. 3 months they hid him in some private apartment of their own house, though probably with the hazard of their own lives, had he been discovered. Herein Moses was a type of Christ, who, in his infancy, was forced to abscond, and in Egypt 2 Mount 2:13, and was wonderfully preserved, when many innocents were butchered. It is said, Heb 11:23, that the parents of Moses hid him by faith. Some think they had a special revelation to them that the deliverer should spring from their loins. However, they had a general promise of Israel's preservation, which they acted faith upon, and in that faith hid their child, not being afraid of the penalty annexed to the king's commandment. Note, faith in God's promise is so far from superseding that it rather excites and quickens to the use of lawful means for the obtaining of mercy. Duty is ours, events are God's. Again, faith in God will set us above the ensnaring fear of man. 2. How he was exposed. At 3 months' end, probably when the searchers came about to look for concealed children, so that they could not hide him any longer, their faith perhaps beginning now to fail, they put him in an ark of bulrushes by the river's brink. B. 3. And set his little sister at some distance to watch what would become of him, and into whose hands he would fall. B. 4. God put it into their hearts to do this, to bring about his own purposes, that Moses might by this means be brought into the hands of Pharaoh's daughter, and that by his deliverance from this imminent danger a specimen might be given of the deliverance of God's church, which now lay thus exposed. Note 1. God takes special care of the outcasts of Israel. P.S. 147, 2. They are his outcasts, Isa. Moses seemed quite abandoned by his friends. His own mother durst not own him, but now the Lord took him up and protected him. P.S. 2. In times of extreme difficulty it is good to venture upon the providence of God. Thus to have exposed their child while they might have preserved it, would have been to tempt Providence. But, when they could not, it was to trust to Providence. Nothing venture, nothing win. If I perish, I perish. Verses 510 here is, I Moses saved from perishing. Come see the place where that great man lay when he was a little child. He lay in a bulrush basket by the river's side. Had he been left to lie there, he must have perished in a little time with hunger, if he had not been sooner washed into the river or devoured by a crocodile. Had he fallen into any other hands than those he did fall into, either they would not, or durst not, have done otherwise than have thrown him straightway into the river. But Providence brings no less a person thither than Pharaoh's daughter, just at that juncture, guides her to the place where this poor forlorn infant lay, and inclines her heart to pity it, which she dares do when none else durst. Never did poor child cry so seasonably, so happily, as this did. The babe wept, which moved the compassion of the princess, as no doubt his beauty did. B. 5, 6. Note 1. Those are hard-hearted indeed that have not a tender compassion for helpless infancy. How pathetically does God represent his compassion for the Israelites in general considered in this pitiable state. As 2. It is very commendable in persons of quality to take cognizance of the distresses of the meanest, and to be helpful and charitable to them. 3. God's care of us in our infancy ought to be often made mention of by us to his praise. Though we were not thus exposed that we were not was God's mercy, yet many were the perils we were surrounded with in our infancy, out of which the Lord delivered us. P.S. 4. God often raises up friends for his people even among their enemies. Pharaoh cruelly seeks Israel's destruction, but his own daughter charitably compassionates a Hebrew child, and not only so, but, beyond her intention, preserves Israel's deliverer. O Lord, how wonderful are thy counsels! 2. Moses well provided with a good nurse, no worse than his own dear mother. V. 79. Pharaoh's daughter thinks it convenient that he should have a Hebrew nurse. Pity that so fair a child should be suckled by a sable Moor, and the sister of Moses, with art and good management, introduces the mother into the place of a nurse, to the great advantage of the child. For mothers are the best nurses, and those who receive the blessings of the breasts with those of the womb are not just if they give them not to those for whose sake they received them. It was also an unspeakable satisfaction to the mother, who received her son as life from the dead, and now could enjoy him without fear. The transport of her joy, upon this happy turn, we may suppose sufficient to betray her to be the true mother. Had there been any suspicion of it, to a less discerning eye than that of Solomon. 1 Key. 3. Moses preferred to be the son of Pharaoh's daughter. B. 10. His parents herein perhaps not only yielding to necessity, having nursed him for her, but too much pleased with the honor thereby done to their son. For the smiles of the world are stronger temptations than its frowns, and more difficult to resist. The tradition of the Jews is that Pharaoh's daughter had no child of her own, and that she was the only child of her father, so that when he was adopted for her son he stood fair for the crown. However, it is certain he stood fair for the best preferments of the court in due time, and in the meantime had the advantage of the best education and improvements of the court, with the help of which, having a great genius, he became master of all the lawful learning of the Egyptians. Acts 7:22. Note 1. Providence pleases itself sometimes in raising the poor out of the dust, to set them among princes. P.S. Many who, by their birth, seem marked for obscurity and poverty, by surprising events of providence are brought to sit at the upper end of the world, to make men know that the heavens do rule. 2. Those whom God designs for great services he find out ways to qualify and prepare beforehand. Moses, by having his education in a court, is the fitter to be a prince and king in Jeshurun. By having his education in a learned court, for such the Egyptian then was, is the fitter to be an historian. And by having his education in the court of Egypt is the fitter to be employed, in the name of God, as an ambassador to that court. IV. Moses named. The Jews tell us that his father, at his circumcision, called him Joachim, but Pharaoh's daughter called him Moses, drawn out of the water, so it signifies in the Egyptian language. The calling of the Jewish lawgiver by an Egyptian name is a happy omen to the Gentile world, and gives hopes of that day when it shall be said, "Blessed be Egypt my people, Isa." And his tuition at court was an earnest of the performance of that promise, Isa. 49:23, Kings shall be thy nursing fathers, and queens thy nursing mothers. Verses 11-15.